So today I'm going to talk about cultural policy, festivals and the performing arts in Oceania, and I will try to move from the local to the national, to the regional, and then to the global levels in terms of some of the issues facing Pacific Islanders and performing arts in the Pacific region. And it's really nice to come after the first session, which kind of mapped out some of the connections in the region, because that gives us some of the background to what I'm going to be talking about today. So very generally, my talk is organized in terms of a focus at first on contemporary Pacific dance and talking about hula from Hawaii, and then to talk about regionalism, regional identities, and particularly focus on the Festival of Pacific Arts. And then to talk very generally and briefly at the end about cultural policy and creative industries, which is a growing kind of issue in the Pacific as Pacific Islanders and Pacific countries figure out ways to participate economically, socially, and politically on a global stage, and where certain leaders and certain regional organizations have recognized culture as this major tool and resource for Pacific Islanders to participate on a global stage. So we need to think a little bit about some of the challenges to that push. So in terms of that challenge, and I think in Taiwan you would be very familiar with this because the creative and cultural industries are very much supported in Taiwan, and I know there are national policies supporting this, especially in terms of focusing on Aboriginal and Indigenous cultures as the basis for cultural and creative industries. But similar things are slowly happening in the Pacific, where there is a commercial imperative or rationale for bringing culture into the economic realm, where there is a heritage preservation and safeguarding kind of rationale for paying more attention to culture, and where there's also this understanding that if you bring culture more into the economic space and you want to preserve and promote heritage in the arts, you also have to integrate cultural knowledge and cultural epistemologies into some of the policies and practices that are being promoted by regional organizations such as the Secretariat of the Pacific Community based in New Caledonia. So this is the broader context for what I'm wanting to talk about today, this kind of regional push for paying attention to culture in the context of these things. But I wanted to start with something that's very concrete and very local and very real from the perspective of Pacific Islanders, because when we talk about bringing dance, bringing music, bringing arts and crafts into the global marketplace, there are a lot of stakes for Pacific Islanders to do that, and there's a lot of fear of losing your culture, losing your tradition, losing your heritage if things get too commercialized or too commodified. So I want to start off by talking about something very concrete, which is hula dance practices in Hawaii, and think about how this one group that I'm going to talk about manages to balance some of these issues. The need to make money off their practice, off their arts, the need to preserve Hawaiian knowledge and Hawaiian history through the arts, and the need to integrate Hawaiian ways of knowing and doing and being into their practice. So I'm going to start off talking about a hula dance school called Halau Hula o Maiki. So Halau Hula o Maiki is based in Honolulu in Hawaii, and I studied dance with this dance school for a year between 2005 and 2006. I have a background in dance and have learned many dances from across the Pacific as well as Western dance. But this was the first time I had ever encountered a way of learning and understanding dance from a very strong pedagogical practice, a very well thought out, very integrated pedagogical practice where this halau managed to balance the past and the present and the future, tradition, modernity, the economics, the politics, and also be very inclusive and welcome all kinds of people into their hula school. So there are people who are Japanese, who are Korean, Chinese, Hawaiian, Anglo-American, many different people participate in this hula school. The woman in the middle is Auntie Maiki, who founded the hula school and is known in Hawaii as one of the mothers of the Hawaiian Renaissance. So she is somebody who brought hula out from kind of the underground where hula had been practiced for a long time, and she made it more formal, and she created a school, and she started a trend where Hawaiians started to practice hula again after many years of missionaries and colonizers trying to marginalize dance and marginalize their hula practice. So I joined this halau and discovered something about dance in the Pacific that I had never encountered before. Now, one of the things that I think is very important in this conference is the relationship between islanders and their environment. And for many of us who study the Pacific, we understand that the Pacific performing arts usually tell stories about the place, about the land, about the sea, about the ancestors. But for me, it was the very first time learning hula in that hula school where the environment was central to our practice, where we had to understand the geography of the island landscape in order to dance in the appropriate fashion. So she didn't just teach us steps. She didn't just teach us where to put our hands and what words to use and how to sing, but she mapped our bodies, our dancing bodies, onto the landscape, onto the island landscape. And in terms of how she positioned us on the landscape, it was very important to know where the mountain was and where the ocean was. Where Mauka, the mountain, and Makai, the sea, or Moana, the ocean was. So we didn't just dance in space, we danced in place. And your bodies had to be placed within the oceanic context and within the island landscape. So for the first few weeks of our dance practice, she just made us turn, face the sea, face the mountain, face the dry side of the island, face the wet side of the island, face the mountain, face the sea, and we just had to orient ourselves to those points of the landscape, even though we couldn't see them from within the dance studio, because there were no windows in the dance studio. So we were positioned in a way that also recognized how Hawaiian landscapes had been divided in the past according to agricultural practices and according to agricultural needs of Hawaiians. So this is an ahupua'a, which is the traditional way in which Hawaiians divided their landscape according to the different ecological systems that go from mountain to the sea. So we actually had to learn and study this in order to be able to do our dance practice. And if we didn't understand this, then we were seen not to be able to embody the dance or the song appropriately. What was very interesting about how she taught us dance was that it allowed us to continue to orient ourselves on a landscape that was changing, a landscape that had been drastically changed over time. So something that may have looked like this in the past starts to look like this in the 1930s as Honolulu and Waikiki get transformed through tourism, and really kind of looks more like this in the 21st century. Even though Hawaiians were continuing to do hula and dance on this landscape, they were able to embody this landscape and this landscape through their dance practices. So it was as if bringing those back to life in the 21st century when really Waikiki looks more like this. And in fact, we would dance at Waikiki for tourists and tell those stories of the landscapes of the past. So even though they didn't exist anymore in a physical form, they existed through the memories and through the dance practices of the women in the hula. So for me, what that did was make very real and very concrete some of these issues facing Pacific Islanders and the performing arts. This is the first song that was taught to us, and it's a song that children, adults, anybody can learn as a way of orienting yourself to the landscape. And even though it's very simple, so the sun, the moon, your house by the pali, the mountains are high and green, the rain and the waterfall, all those things are actions that people recognize, tourists recognize when they come to watch hula, but they actually embody some very, very important values in terms of Hawaiian culture. One of the most important things that I got out of it, and I never used to think about this, all islanders often take the ocean for granted. We often take the sea for granted. And she just told us a very small thing about how we were to move our bodies. She said, when you're doing the ocean, this is the ocean. This is not the ocean. Because the ocean is very big and very deep. This is Moana. But this is Kai. This is the sea. It's a lot more shallow. It's closer to the beach. So don't do this when you're talking about this. And don't do this if you're talking about this. And for somebody who grew up around the sea, you know, and just kind of took it for granted, if you're dancing about the ocean, you have to be very careful because the ocean is different in different places. The depth of the ocean matters, the lagoon matters, the shallow waters matter, where you get your seaweed, all of those things matter. And so for the first time, you know, I was in my 30s, it suddenly struck me that these are not just metaphors, they're not just conceptual frameworks, but if you put your body on the line and have to tell that story about the ocean through dance, then you get it. But it almost takes that dancing in order to actually get it through your body. So what was really interesting for me when thinking about cultural policy is that you have to still pay attention to the specifics of the dance practice, or the arts practice, or the musical practice. Decision makers and leaders who are now trying to create policy around the arts, for me they have to know about these very minute and specific practices in order to understand how better to support the arts, how better to bring the arts into an economic context. And it is practitioners like this hula school, and there are many around the Pacific, who I think get that balance between preservation, promotion, keeping the values of the past while still doing it in a contemporary creative context, maintaining that thread across time and space, that thread of value for your ancestors and for the land and the environment and the sea. So I want to move from the context of Hawaii to New Zealand, where for many of us, especially many of us who are dancers or who are artists, it is really important for there to be an exchange of ideas across the islands and between artists. But we recognize that even though some of us get to learn the dance and the music of other cultures, there are huge economic and political stakes when it comes to the performing arts. I love this image because for me it embodies everything in terms of the politics of New Zealand. As many of you know, New Zealand is kind of founded on a treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi, between indigenous Māori and the English settlers. And what's been really interesting is that the settlers and the Māori have kind of been dancing around each other for a long time, right? Since the Treaty of Waitangi in the 1800s. And when this group in 2001 decided to put ballet and haka on stage together, there was a lot of panic and a lot of concern about how on earth you could put ballet and haka together on the same stage, and would they be dancing together, or would they be dancing apart? Would they be dancing side by side? Because dance, for both Europeans and for Maori is a huge symbol in terms of political, social, cultural, and historical identity. It's not just entertainment. So the title of the magazine was kind of a panicky, what next? Like if they're going to dance together, what else are they going to do together? And what was really interesting in terms of this performance is actually that they never danced together. Of course they didn't let the ballerina dance with the Maori warrior. No way, they'd never do that in New Zealand. It was posed just for the magazine. It was posed just for the photograph. And when it came to the performance, Kapahaka troupe danced, then the ballerinas came on, and they danced apart, but shared a stage. So for me, this sort of sets up this idea that we can try to approach the performing arts in a strategic fashion, but at the end of the day, the stakes are very high for people in the Pacific when it comes to what happens with their art. And as many of you know, it's because unlike in other cultures in the Pacific, our history is actually preserved through the performing arts. We do not have a written tradition. So art, music, dance, carvings, architecture are the methods in which we archive our histories. So they are not just there for entertainment or to tell interesting stories, but they are very much our library in a way. The performing arts, music, and dance are the libraries of Pacific Islanders. Another good example of this is, and it's actually the opposite of the New Zealand example, is this dance group from Fiji, which is the Shobna Chanel dance group. Unlike this group, this performance where they dance side by side, two cultures dance side by side, what the choreographer in this group did is she mixed Indian dance and Fijian dance. She fused them, she brought them together in a fusion and created a new kind of dance. And in Fiji, if any of you know the history of Fiji, one of the biggest tensions in Fiji has been around race relationships between Indians and Fijians, where there always seem to be separate and never able to kind of come together strategically in a political or even in a cultural fashion. Intermarriage between Fijians and Indians for a long time has kind of been a taboo thing. And so when this choreographer brought Fijians and Indians together on the same stage and made her Indian girls do Fijian dance and Fijian boys do Indian dance, and she mixed all the costuming, people in Fiji really thought that this was a huge deal because it said something about relations between the races in Fiji. Was it possible to actually have a truly multicultural Fiji where the races did not exist side by side, but actually in cooperation and collaboration with each other? So that's another example of the potential of the performing arts in a political context. I'm just going to skip forward now to talk about things at a more regional level. Some of the examples that I've given just up to this point have very been much based on a local context or on a national context. And what's really interesting in the Pacific, and I think we all understand that the borders and boundaries of the Pacific have been historically constructed and things have been very different before Europeans came into the Pacific. What's interesting is that the performing arts does give us this opportunity to talk about regionalism and regional identities in new and interesting ways. So this is the standard map of the Pacific that many of us who do Pacific studies are used to, with the borders and the boundaries around Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. And at the Festival of the Pacific Arts, which is held every 4 years in a different part of the Pacific, contingents are often organized according to those standard borders and boundaries that we're used to on the map. What's really interesting, though, at these regional arts gatherings is that this idea that both diversity and unity exist in Oceania becomes very, very clear. We're all very familiar with how diverse the Pacific is from a linguistic perspective, from a cultural perspective, and in terms of the Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia divide. But what becomes really clear at gatherings such as the Festival of Arts is the intense unity of the Pacific. We can speculate that it's just a contemporary thing and that in the past the whole region wasn't united in this way. And I think it depends on which archaeologists and linguistics you're reading in order to buy that argument. But at the Festival of Arts, it becomes very clear that in the present, Pacific Islanders are very much trying to form this regional oceanic identity. However, they're trying to do it out of the diversity, where they still maintain the nation-state boundaries, where they still maintain their local boundaries, where the Hawaiians do hula, the Samoans do the Samoan dance, the Tongans do the Tongan dance. And so it makes you think about how both the diversity and unity can coexist together, and what kind of new kinships or new relationships get formed in the context of the performing arts. I think one of the papers asked, I think it was Pierre Miranda's paper, asked this question about if there's a regional identity, what would the lingua franca be? What would be the language that everyone speaks to each other? And I think it is possible that it could be a musical language and a dance language as well. It doesn't have to be a lingua franca in the way that we understand it, but the sharing of rhythms, the sharing of music, the sharing of performing arts is another way in which Pacific Islanders make these connections between each other. And the Festival of Arts very much embodies that possibility. Now I'm running out of time, actually, so I'm just going to wrap up a little bit. One of the things that's important about the Festival of Arts is that it's supported by the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, and they're based in Noumea. The Secretariat of the Pacific Community has come up with a new project called Structuring the Culture Sector for Sustainable Development. Now, I'm just going to go forward to that, because what's important about this project is that they're now trying to formalize culture and the arts in the Pacific. It may be more common in Asia to talk about creative industries or cultural industries, but that's very new for Pacific Islanders. The stakes of those kinds of projects are very high, and we're at the point where researchers and scholars and educators are having to do a lot of homework about the potential for this kind of project and its impact on dancers, on musicians, on artists, and so forth. The next festival, which is going to be in the Solomon Islands next year, and I've been talking to the High Commissioner from the Solomon Islands about it, because it's a very exciting opportunity for the Solomon Islands. That will come at a time when the discourse about the importance of the festival is changing in the Pacific, and where it's becoming more significant in an economic sense. And so I think we're at a place in time where there's a lot to think about in terms of that. And there's a lot to think about also in terms of the participation of countries like Taiwan and West Papua and other countries who have been trying to make their connections to the Pacific through the Festival of Arts. And I'm looking forward to see what will happen with the Festival of Arts in the Solomon Islands in terms of how we conceive of Oceania and who belongs to it. Thank you very much.